What were the ultimate goals of the Soviet Union during the Cold War? Survival, global revolution, something in between? And how did those objectives shift with the changing of the guard at the top of the communist regime? And how did they interact with the designs of Russia's main adversary, the United States? Let's get into it.
It is a prescription for war, this Iraqi invasion of Kuwait.
December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy.
The bloody experience of Vietnam is to end in a stalemate.
We continue to face a grave situation in Iran.
The people who knock these buildings down will hear all of us soon.
We shall fight on the beaches, we shall fight on the landing grounds, we shall fight in the fields and in the streets. We shall never surrender.
For maps, videos, and images, follow us on Instagram, and also feel free to follow me on Twitter at Aaron B. McLean. Hi, I'm Aaron McLean. Thanks for joining School of War. I'm delighted to be joined today by Sergey Radchenko. He's the Wilson E. Schmidt Distinguished Professor at the Kissinger Center at Johns Hopkins SAIS. He's based at SAIS Europe Bologna, which I confess I did not realize existed until I was reading your bio, and that's where you're speaking to us now. How long have you lived in Italy, Sergey?
I've been here for about 3 years. It's a wonderful place. Cannot complain. It's great to be in Bologna, but it's also great to be at an American institution like SAIS, Johns Hopkins, while being in Bologna.
And I should say the reason for your joining us today is you have published this weighty, in every sense, in the literal sense, and I think in the sense of impact, book called "To Run the World: The Kremlin's Cold War Bid for Global Power." So thank you for making the time today. And I think where I'd like to start, because there's a tremendous amount to cover here, is you, in addition to sort of themes that one would expect to discover in any account of the Cold War, themes of how countries or great powers strive for security, or the ways in which they're motivated by ideology and how these things balance, you introduce other terms into your scheme or your analysis. One is ambition, and the other is a desire for recognition. These are linked things, and you suggest that they are very important to understanding Soviet motivation. So could you just start there, sort of big picture, explain how you think about Soviet decision-making and Soviet behavior through the Cold War in terms of these terms that are important to your argument?
Well, that's right. I mean, this is a novel argument to a certain degree, because much of our writing about the Cold War focused historically on issues such as ideology, competition between two systems, capitalism versus communism, to a lesser extent, or security, as you mentioned. And I bring in a slightly different angle by looking at the striving for legitimacy by the Soviet leaders, this striving for a place in the world which they think agreed to their expectation of where they should be in the world system. They wanted recognition by other powers of that position. And that's hence the question of recognition comes in, because how do you arrive at a place in the world that you feel you deserve? Well, you want others to recognize that this is what you are, right? You want others to recognize this. So in a sense, it's a simple concept. And indeed, we know, even in the post-Cold War period, we know that Russia and China have been all about ambition, all about status, all about their ranking in the global system. But what bothered me is, why is it that we never really approached this question historically and looked at how the Soviets strove towards recognition, strove towards legitimacy during the Cold War? And as I investigated documents, and of course now we have volumes and volumes of newly declassified documents, which I was very fortunate to access, I realized that this indeed was a key motive. And that is not to say that ideology did not matter. It's not to say that security did not matter. All of those things matter, but I almost construct like a Maslow pyramid of needs in my book. I say, yeah, of course, a security mattered, et cetera, et cetera. But in the end, what they wanted was self-actualization. They wanted to be recognized as something important. That is the Soviets. But I also talk about China in the book as well. And indeed, much of the book deals with China in China's own striving for recognition.
And I should say, in addition to your published work, folks should check out your Twitter account, which I've enjoyed for years, because I mean, for many reasons, but most, I think, distinctively, these nuggets from the archives that you will pull out and give brief analyses on, which I've enjoyed very much.
Well, that's right. So I was just going to add about the archives, and this is what a lot of people sometimes are confused about. You say, well, how can you go to Russia and do research? Aren't the Russian archives closed? And I would say, well, they used to be closed, but it's counterintuitive to think about it. But in the last 10 years, I would say there's been a remarkable declassification process in Russia, and so much more stuff has come to light that we can retell not almost every Cold War crisis with new materials, and sometimes, smoking gun evidence that changes our interpretation of how we see the Cold War and what mattered. Sometimes, the evidence reinforces existing interpretations. Of course, I was also very fortunate to live and work in China for about 4 years, where I also collected documents which have now become closed. They had a period, I won't say openness, but things were easier in China or in the Hu Jintao when I was there, and now these things are closed. But what these materials allow us to do is to take almost kind of a surgical, very detailed approach to Soviet and Chinese policymaking. We can see what those leaders thought on any particular day about particular issues, because we have just literally thousands of pages of their conversations, of their rants. Sometimes, like in Khrushchev's case, Khrushchev liked to rant publicly, and all of that was recorded, at Politburo meetings. Anyway, so it's a lot of new material.
I'm troubled by when we talk about Khrushchev, I'm struggling to wipe the image of Steve Buscemi in The Death of Stalin from my eyes. It's a very unserious thing to say, but nevertheless, there it is.
I enjoy it too. Yeah, I enjoy it.
Well, how do you square the increased access to archives in Russia with the political turn that Russia has taken over the same period of time? How do those two things go together?
I mean, that's an interesting question, right? Because at one level, you see growing authoritarianism in Russia, and indeed Putin consolidating his control, cracking down on media, things looking increasingly grim. And of course, now we've also had the invasion of Ukraine. But at the same time, I guess it's just a question of Russian bureaucracy, the wheels, slowly turning. I mean, there is a law on declassification, so they were declassifying stuff. And so what I found, that was actually a remarkable feeling, to be in the archive. They're bringing out all these materials from personal papers of Stalin, Khrushchev, Brezhnev, Andropov, and you're sitting there as the first researcher ever allowed to work with these papers. Nobody has seen these papers before. And every page you read, it's just, you're waiting for discoveries. And there are so many interesting things there.
Let me ask kind of a dumb version of a question about the early Cold War here as a way of getting us into Stalin, but linked to this theme of recognition and the desire for recognition. In the summer of 1945, the Soviet Union has shouldered a tremendous part of the burden of defeating Nazi Germany. Its troops are in Berlin. It is, one of really only two great powers, with the United States to come out of World War II. I mean, grievously wounded, but arguably in a stronger position than it began. Who needs further recognition? Why is this the point where a desire for recognition and a struggle for greater legitimacy, or for legitimacy, drives Joseph Stalin? I mean, doesn't he have a supreme place at the table at this moment?
What he has at this moment is power. But power without legitimacy is insecure power. So he wants this power to be recognized. And he was very insistent on it even before the war ended. He had his conversations with Churchill. You remember the percentages agreement. I mean, historians have known about it. I've also now seen the Russian side of that. And what struck me there was just how seriously the Soviets debated percentages with the British. They literally got into these meetings and they would say, okay, so we'll get 75% influence in Hungary, you get 25%. And the British would push for more, and the Soviets would say, no, we want extra 2%. What does it even mean? It seems completely ridiculous, but they were getting into those conversations, which I find remarkable. Stalin felt that if the Soviet sphere is recognized, and this way he would be more legitimate and therefore more secure in his ambitions. And so he was sometimes willing to pull back from some of the adventures which he could have potentially participated in, the key, of course, being the Greek Civil War. Now, I talk about it in the book, how eventually he did come around to support the Greek Revolution to a greater extent. We now have remarkable documents about this. But also in China. I mean, China is a key example where he basically sent a telegram to Mao Zedong saying, no civil war, sorry, make a deal with the nationalist Chinese government, with the government of Chiang Kai-shek. Mao was absolutely outraged because this entailed a betrayal of an ally, but he had to do it because Stalin forced him to. So he went to Chongqing and had negotiations with Chiang Kai-shek. And so there are instances like this. I mean, another interesting example is Stalin initially planning to divide Japan, sort of like Korea was ultimately divided. So he was making a bid for a northern part of Japan, Hokkaido. And Truman said, no, you can't do that. And Stalin backed off. And you kind of have to ask yourself, did he back off because he was perhaps intimidated, afraid of the atomic bomb? Or was he trying to still maintain a semblance of, kind of agreement with the United States over legitimate spheres? And I'm not 100% sure in the book. And nobody can be sure, right? This is a historian's problem. Even now, 80 years later, we're debating these things, and nobody can get into Stalin's head and say, well, here's exactly what Stalin thought. But there are indications. We can at least kind of try to appreciate his thinking. And what struck me is just how much he valued American recognition of his gains.
Let's linger here for a bit, because I don't need to tell you libraries are full. There are libraries that could be devoted to the question of how the Cold War begins and who started it and who bears the greater share of the responsibility. Is it Soviet revolutionary zeal and imperialism? Is it American paranoia that provokes a reaction? Is it somewhere in between? What is your statement? What is your take on this longstanding debate?
I think in this particular debate, I tend to side more with the traditional view, i.e. that Stalin was mainly responsible for the Cold War. I mean, in the end, it's very difficult to say, because some historians will say, well, Stalin wanted cooperation. He wanted great power cooperation. But we simply don't know. I mean, we pushed back against Stalin, we meaning the West. There was a pushback against Stalin. It came to be known as containment, right? If containment was not there, would Stalin have said, okay, fine, I just have my sphere here that I have. I will not push any further. Or would he have said, on the other hand, hey, look at these opportunities that are opening up. How about I exploit this? And I think Stalin was deeply cynical, deeply pragmatic, and highly opportunistic. I think George Kennan was spot on when he described this quality in Soviet foreign policy, this opportunism. And so if containment did not exist, then I think Stalin would have potentially gone further and further. We don't know that. We don't know that for sure. But when in a situation when we do not know, I think the safest policy to pursue is a policy of containment, because the price of getting it wrong was going to be Soviet domination. The price of getting it, of getting it wrong the other way was simply the Cold War. So in the end, we ended up with the Cold War. As far as, the specific issues that led straight into, communization of Eastern Europe and so on, I talk about this in the book at length. And in particular, I highlight one interesting issue, and that is Stalin's realization that communists could not come to power in Europe through elections. He realized that, early it wasn't, now we say, well, this was obvious from the start, but it wasn't obvious in 1945 because Communist parties were genuinely popular, not just in countries like, let's say, Czechoslovakia or let's say Yugoslavia, but also in France and Italy, where communists were making gains. And then Stalin realized that this was not going to happen. Elections were being held without Soviet intervention, without Soviet manipulation. Communists would have been defeated in Eastern Europe. And so once he started to realize that, and we're talking about late 1946, 1947, I think he changed his whole approach, and he realized that if he wanted to maintain his sphere of influence in Eastern Europe, at least, then it would have to be through brutal intimidation.
You on this question of the American dilemma, you were at the Kissinger Center, and you quote Henry Kissinger, this fantastic line that sums up the dilemma: that the powers which represent legitimacy and the status quo cannot know that their antagonist is not amenable to reason until he has demonstrated it. and he will not have demonstrated it until the international system is already overturned. So if you wait for Hitler to invade Poland, or you wait for the Soviets to come crashing through the Fulda Gap, well, you know the answer.
Well, exactly.
But
That's the dilemma. That is the dilemma, right? That's the dilemma that not only Truman faced back in 1945 when he was dealing with Stalin, but it's also a dilemma we face today. And indeed, one of the issues of the book that I think is going to be very appealing to readers is that I try to go beyond the Cold War, because generally Cold War histories basically cover the Cold War and say, okay, 89, the Berlin Wall falls, everyone lives happily thereafter. But we know, of course, that this particular generation of Cold War scholarship proved to be, I would say, not connected enough with the present time. So today we're living in a very different time where confrontation has returned to international politics, certainly here in Europe, but also looking broadly at for example, the Sino-American relationship. It seems that we're almost moving into another Cold War. And so under those circumstances, you can connect the Cold War and thinking about, American responses to Stalin, thinking about how Americans dealt with the Cold War, and you connect that to the present. You see a lot of interesting parallels, including, Russian desire for some special sphere of influence, Russian desire for some special, position in the world order, which is very similar to how Stalin, for example, thought about some of the same questions. So I see a lot of continuity between the Cold War and the post-Cold War period and onto our own day.
Yeah. I don't want to get too far from the chronological narrative, and I want to come back to Khrushchev in a second, but just continuing from where you are right now. Another obvious reason to devote the attention to the Cold War that you have and to work to connect it to the present is it is the only example we have of great power confrontation in the nuclear world. There are no other case studies at scale, right? And so you I think you have several nice turns of phrase to describe the situation. One of which, sort of borrowing from Fukuyama and Hegel, that that nuclear parity really does introduce a kind of end of history. Not in a silly literal sense, obviously, but in a deep sense, at least until it doesn't work anymore.
That's right.
I'll just go back to being cavemen.
Well, I mean, that's extremely interesting, right? Because today we people talk all the time about parallels to the present. We like looking at history and say, well, where can we see precedents to what we're experiencing today? And some people point to the period before the First World War, saying, well, there's great power rivalry, et cetera, et cetera. It seems similar. But I don't see that at all. I think this nuclear revolution is what really made the Cold War the Cold War. Without the nuclear revolution, it would have been very, very different. But nuclear revolution, and that's the irony. With the end of the Cold War, it was not undone. We are still living in a world full of nuclear weapons. And so what does that mean? And I try to draw on Fukuyama, who I admire greatly. His book is The End of History is endlessly trashed by people.
Generally people who haven't read it,
who haven't read it. That's right. He's got a very interesting philosophical discussion there about the desire for recognition, for which he draws on Hegel, filtered through Alexander Kojève. It was a very interesting, philosophical tradition there. But this desire for recognition is certainly one of the key themes of Fukuyama's scholarship in general, not just this particular book. But I sort of, use that idea and apply it in a different context. And I say, well, if you take the Hegelian struggle between the master and the slave, that is, it's part of Hegel's description, and that it's what that Fukuyama draws upon. Then you could argue that the fact that you have nuclear power effectively takes out this element of fear of death on the part of great powers. If you're a nuclear power, you don't really worry about being invaded. Sort of like, let's say, the Soviet Union is or Russia before it was invaded. They know how they previously had this fear of invasion. I think with nuclear weapons, things change. I think that changes, and what changes then is that you cannot really destroy this power. You can only play this competition can only play out in other areas of the world. Hence, you have proxy wars. And in the end, this power can only destroy itself, which is, of course, what happened to the Soviet Union. So in this sense, the nuclear revolution does introduce a kind of end of history in the Hegelian sense, although I think Hegel would be very upset about this particular characterization.
No, well, I have two young male children. My children in the house, and the older brother walks around in a fair amount of regular anxiety about the younger brother's bids for power. So I watch the master-slave dialectic play out, sometimes multiple times daily, in the McLean household.
I don't want to overdo Hegel. Look, I think this. It's a useful anecdote to mention in the book. And, it's not what makes it so long, but, I had to mention it. But in the end, I think historians need to be upfront about their assumptions and their, the influences that they're under. I never used to do that. But now I feel like, I can see where some of the ideas that I draw upon, where they come from. And I can see Hegel being there. I can see, Fukuyama being there, etc.
Yeah, and look, I mean, the problem with any too easy reference to 1914 as a source of historical analogy, and to be clear, it's possible to make too easy references to the 1930s as well, is that in 1914, as best as I can tell, most of the major powers, certainly the aggressive powers, thought they could win the war. They thought they were going to fight a war, which they would then stand a good chance of winning and coming out stronger than they began the war. And it is hard to imagine any leader by the midpoint of the Cold War, let alone today. You seem to mark it around the Cuban Missile Crisis that the realization sets in, and maybe that's something we should discuss. The thinking that you could start a direct major power confrontation using all instruments of national power, and for it not to be suicidal. It's obviously your suicide and national suicide are nearly inevitable outcomes. Is it the Cuban Missile Crisis? Where does the logic of nuclear weapons in its fully developed sense set in the Cold War story?
Around this time, I mean, I would date it maybe even a little bit earlier. Obviously, Khrushchev comes around to this idea that nuclear weapons provide guarantees for the Soviet Union fairly early on. And he also realizes already by the mid-50s that he could use atomic weapons for nuclear blackmail. He tries to do that in the Suez Crisis in 1956. The Suez Crisis is then resolved. And he thinks that it's because he made nuclear threats against Britain and France. Now, we know, of course, that it wasn't that for that reason. It was basically because of the United States and American pressure on Great Britain that the British decided to pull out of this whole misadventure. But Khrushchev doesn't know that. And so he feels, wow, this is great. I've got these weapons and I can basically use them to threaten my adversaries. And then he proceeds to do that in 1957 in the Syrian crisis. He does it in 58 in the Middle East crisis. Well, there was a dual crisis, really, one in the Middle East, the other in China, of course, the Taiwan Straits crisis, the second Taiwan Straits crisis. But then he really does it in Berlin. And this is where it comes really to the point where he has to consider it very carefully. There's a Politburo meeting in 1961 where he weighs the possibility of war. And he says, well, would the Americans really fight a war, nuclear war, over where? Over Berlin? That's ridiculous. Why would they do that? That's completely ridiculous. So he basically gives the percentage as 5%. He says, the chances of war with the United States over West Berlin are 5%. And, he has a very highly sycophantic presidium who all kind of say, yeah, that sounds great. Although I think Anastas Mikoyan was a little bit, his sidekick Anastas Mikoyan was a little bit careful with this, but he was the only one who cautioned against this kind of assumptions. But anyway, when push came to shove and Khrushchev had to decide whether to push the United States, whether to bring the matter to the brink and see whether the Americans would capitulate over Berlin, in other words, effectively abandon West Berlin to the Soviets, he decided not to do it. And why is that? Because he understood the danger of a nuclear confrontation. And I think that's where it sets in, even before the Cuban Missile Crisis. But it truly develops, the sphere of nuclear confrontation develops by the time of the Cuban Missile Crisis, because there, Khrushchev, this is the guy who lived through the Second World War, right? Who lost his son in the Second World War. And then now he's facing this possibility of a nuclear confrontation with the United States. Not only that, but he has his dear, ally Fidel Castro sending him telegrams saying, how about we strike the United States first? At this point, Khrushchev just explodes. We have his various rants. I was very fortunate to have access to this material, but this is basically Khrushchev would just basically dictate a lot. He did not read so many books, he did not write all that much, but he loved to dictate, to basically rant, and all of the stuff would be taken down. And some of his letters to Castro are just remarkable because he tries to kind of reason with Castro and say, and he rants against Castro, says, rails against Castro, say, why, how only a crazy person can think like that. We don't want to go to a nuclear war with the United States, etc. So Khrushchev realizes that the logic of nuclear confrontation fully by October 1960.
World War II is a through line through all of the major Cold War Soviet leaders, and you identify it as central to their thinking and to their decisions. What is the total effect? What's the through line of the impact of the war on them, and then maybe if there are variations between Stalin, Khrushchev, Brezhnev, Gorbachev, Andropov, I guess. What are those? What is the impact of World War II on Soviet leaders' thinking?
Well, I think it's the fear of repetition. These are people who saw the horrors of war. I was really struck by Khrushchev's recollections of Stalingrad, where he recounted later that there were so many corpses that they had to burn them, and they would pile corpses, mix them together with pieces of wood, and set them on fire. And he recounted this sight much later. He really knew what war was like, a real war. Brezhnev who succeeded Khrushchev, he was also involved in the Second World War, actually was wounded during a landing in Novorossiysk, was thrown off a boat. Andropov was not directly on the front lines, but he was in charge of a guerrilla movement in the north of Russia, northwest, I should say. So those people really experienced the war, and I think that gave them a sense of caution that sometimes I find is lacking in present-day leaders. Consider Brezhnev. Brezhnev was absolutely obsessed with the idea of promoting peace. And you could say, well, promoting peace, that's just Soviet propaganda. But for Brezhnev, it was a fixation. He would meet with foreign leaders. He would say things like, we have to be remembered by history. What will history remember us by? We have to be the ones who bring the world to peace. And for him, this whole idea of détente was very much about avoiding nuclear war, about peacemaking. I mean, Vlad Zubok, of course, talks about this in his book about Soviet foreign policy. I think he's correct in the sense of seeing Brezhnev as first and foremost peacemaker, ideologically committed to the idea of peace. So I think the fear, the previous experience of war really affected the way they approached foreign policy.
Well, that is, it's very concerning. You said this in passing, but we should, I think, linger on it for a second. That then one thing that does not hold in any analogy you could construct between using the Cold War as a way of understanding present-day dilemmas is this memory of the Second World War, which is alive for all of these leaders. It's also alive for Americans, even if they did not witness the devastation of their own homeland. They didn't experience suffering on the scale that the Soviets did. Nevertheless, they witnessed, many of them, and many of the leaders witnessed suffering on a vast scale elsewhere. And obviously,
that's right. They were
many Americans died in combat.
Well, that's right. Kennedy, JFK, of course, played a key role in the Cuban Missile Crisis. Was a boat captain, right, in the Second World War. So of course he knew what war was like. Of course he knew what suffering was like, and he had lost his members of his own family during the Second World War, much like Khrushchev. So I think that gave a very different perspective to leaders of the Cold War, which I think current leaders unfortunately lacking.
Well, this goes back to Fukuyama, who among the qualities of his book, as you know, is as you get to the final chapters, he starts to explore all the possible things that could be wrong with his argument and why, liberal democracy may not actually have triumphed in the end, or if it has, how it will sort of fall apart. And all of his sort of, self-criticism ultimately then predicts what happens in the 1990s and 20-aughts and the rise of authoritarianism in various forms. But
he does have he does have this little interesting thing about men with small chests.
Exactly. Yes.
The war, where where he plays on this role of the issue of recognition and the issue of I guess, feeling proud of yourself, etc., and how liberal democracy. And he almost hints at the desirability of having little wars.
Exactly.
Book,
And boredom. The role
Yeah.
that boredom will play, that boredom will set in, because unlike a Khrushchev or a Gorbachev who can't they can't look away from the reality of what a war will be because they've seen it and lived it. As we get further and further away from anything at that scale, you could imagine flippancy and boredom and a lack of seriousness setting. And you sort of suggest, I'm curious to know, you sort of suggest you see it now.
Yeah, I do see it now. I do see a great degree of irresponsibility now. What strikes me in present day discourse is the almost dismissive attitude that people have towards nuclear weapons, certainly in some of our public discussions, which is in great contrast to the Cold War, where I guess maybe the memory of Hiroshima was still present, and the realization of just what a horrible conflict it could be was very much current, both in the Soviet Union, but also in the United States, which I don't see this today. People don't seem to be, it's almost like we're taking nuclear weapons for granted. Oh yeah, they exist, but we don't really think about them in the same way that Cold War leaders were thinking about it. And they were, of course, thinking both in terms of using nuclear weapons, because that whole strategy of potential confrontation between the Soviet Union and the United States rested on the idea of using nuclear weapons. And also they were absolutely horrified by the prospect of this ever happening.
We could go back to Détente in this sort of middle phase of the Cold War. I'm more familiar with the question of Détente from the American side, what Kissinger was thinking, what Nixon was thinking, what their foreign policy thinking implied for their sort of understanding of the American project. And, roughly my sense is that by the late 60s, there is an impression that America is no longer in a position to dominate in the way that it was 20 years earlier, that the Soviet Union was here to stay, that it was achieving military parity. And so the Nixon argument, the Kissinger argument on some level is this is recognizing reality, dealing with reality, surrendering or suppressing at least some of our deeply held universalist assumptions about the direction of world history, and just dealing with another great power as a great power, setting aside its revolutionary characteristics. On this, I'm interested. One would think, from that American self-understanding, that the Soviets wouldn't have an equal interest in if they're doing so well and on the rise. Why would they have an equal interest in Détente? Why would Brezhnev be so committed to Détente? Say more about that. I'm fascinated by the Soviet desire for Détente.
So there are all kinds of factors there that are very, very important. First of all, Détente starts as European Détente before it even becomes Soviet-American Détente, right? The Soviets reach out to the French. They, after 1969, try to build closer ties with West Germany, with Willy Brandt, who's also pursuing his Ostpolitik. And that actually had a very pragmatic aspect. The Soviets had really wanted to shake NATO's solidarity, to undermine NATO's solidarity. And they thought that when, for example, in 1966, de Gaulle declared that France would no longer be in the military structures of NATO, the Soviets thought, oh, this is great. That shows the road forward. Maybe NATO is starting to fall apart. So they were very keen to play France against Germany, Germany against France, both of them against the United States. This was part of the tactical play. But there are other issues here, and I think they're more of a strategic character. First, very important issue is the issue of China. China becomes an absolute obsession for the Soviet leaders. I mean, it was obsession throughout this period. I talk a lot about this in the book, but certainly by the late 1960s, I mean, they're actually fighting a war with China by 1969, right? They have border clashes at Damansky, Zhenbaodao in March 69, and they're really just paranoid about it. They're absolutely paranoid. And this paranoia of theirs has a cultural underpinning, which is very interesting, which you would not expect. So Brezhnev keeps talking about China as an alien civilization. Oh, the Chinese, we cannot trust them. They're strange people, but we're Europeans. And so he keeps pushing this idea. I even have a chapter or subchapter in the book called Brezhnev the European. He keeps talking about this idea of the Soviet Union as the European power. And so he sees European Détente, but also ultimately the turn towards the United States as part of an effort to counter China, which he sees as an existential threat for Russia. existential threat, almost in kind of civilizational terms. So that is another factor. And the next factor I would say that has been under-stressed, I think, is the economic factor. And Brezhnev understands that there's money to be made from developing economic relations with the West. And indeed, if you look at what he's doing in the early 70s, he starts building pipelines. He's trying to get the West Germans to pay for it, which they do. He builds, he starts exporting. I mean, some of that even precedes the 1970s, but it really picks up in the 1970s. And the Soviet economy becomes really interconnected with the world economy, in particular the Western economy. And that's an interesting facet of the Cold War, which you really rarely hear, because you almost think in autarkic terms. So the Soviets were by themselves, the West was by itself. Not like that at all. In fact, the Soviets increasingly came to depend on their ability to sell oil and gas to the Europeans, earn money from it, hard cash, which then they used to import grain, etc. So the economic aspect was very interesting. And indeed, in the first meeting between Brezhnev and Nixon, one of the issues discussed was the idea of when Brezhnev went to Moscow during the summit in May 1972. I mean, one of the ideas the Soviets were really pushing was the idea of a big gas deal between the United States and the Soviet Union, which ultimately was not realized. So the economic factor was very important. And finally, and that I think is hugely important, it's the notion of recognition. This is where the Soviets, that's why they put so much emphasis on the so-called basic principles. The document that was signed during the May 1972 visit by Nixon, the document was called Basic Principles of Relations between the United States and the Soviet Union, and it emphasized equality. It emphasized equality because for Brezhnev, the key factor was that the Americans were now coming around. As you said, the Americans were recognizing that they're kind of, not necessarily on the way down, but they have to make some space for an emerging power. And this emerging power was the Soviet Union. And therefore, the Americans would henceforth have to recognize the Soviet equality and indeed manage the world together with the United States. So we have this remarkable moment in the spring of 1973 when Henry Kissinger travels to Moscow. Brezhnev takes him to Zavidovo, which is a hunting resort outside of Moscow, about 2 hours away, and they go there hunting boars. And in the privacy of one of the towers, you can imagine Kissinger trying to hunt boars from that position. But anyway, in the privacy of the tower, Brezhnev basically makes this pitch to Kissinger. He says, according to Kissinger's recollection later in a conversation with Nixon, he says, Brezhnev basically told me, you and I, you, the Americans, and I, the Soviet Union, we want to run the world. Hence the title of the book, To Run the World. The idea that basically the United States and the Soviet Union would need to cooperate to manage the world.
And then Nixon resigns, Brezhnev gets sick, and Scoop Jackson starts making trouble in the Senate. And it all comes under a lot of pressure. Walk us through how this sort of mutually desired, this is overstating it, but nevertheless, mutually desired condominium, which in the early 1970s seems to be a prospect. It's more complicated than that. Obviously, Nixon and Kissinger want to use China to pressure the Soviets, and it's not actually like everyone's just going to get along. Nevertheless, how does this all fall apart?
Well, it is very interesting. And the big question here is, was it sustainable, really? Because as you say, it seemed like Kissinger was indulging, he was sort of working with Brezhnev, but at the same time, the Americans were more than happy to stab the Soviets in the back like they did in the Middle East. Kissinger was famous for his ability to outplay the Soviets there, and the Soviets reciprocated fully where they could score points at America's expense. They did so. So, I mean, it really raises questions about stability of Détente as a concept, which is relevant for the present day as well. If you have a strategic competition between two superpowers, can you really cooperate? Or will you try to ultimately undercut one another? That's a good question. I think the book is leaning towards the latter explanation. But then, the personal relationship was important. I mean, Brezhnev loved Nixon. He absolutely admired Nixon. We have this most remarkable conversation between Nixon and Brezhnev in the Oval Office, where if you read the transcript, the transcript that was published in Foreign Relations of the United States, among other places, it reads fine enough. But if you compare it to what was actually said, you realize that the transcript does not actually reflect the the actual conversation. Now, how do we know the actual conversation? It turns out, of course, that Nixon was recording the Oval Office, hence, Watergate, etc. But we have this remarkable conversation where Brezhnev just goes full out, just flattering Nixon, saying, it's just remarkable, really, replaying the same themes about recognition, greatness, power, of great powers, and so on. So he loved Nixon, and he was really disappointed that Nixon was defeated by Watergate. Indeed, the Soviets were even trying. There was a remarkable moment where one of Brezhnev's aides was writing to Andropov, who was the head of the KGB, saying, "Can we help Nixon in this Watergate business? Because clearly his enemies are trying to bring him down." And Andropov responded, "Well, we're not sure, but we can try." So there's this remarkable story. In the end, obviously, couldn't do anything. But then Brezhnev himself deteriorated very sharply. He had a mental breakdown in the fall of 1974, and he never developed a good relationship with Ford, who succeeded Nixon. And that lack of personal engagement, I think, mattered a great deal to the fortunes of Détente as well, and which continued to deteriorate. I mean, we had Africa in the mid-1970s, which added fuel to the fire. Then ultimately we had Afghanistan, which really brought, by that time, I think Détente was dead.
So if the transition from, whatever the foreign policy of Stalin and Khrushchev represents to Détente represents some kind of dimming of revolutionary zeal and embrace of something else. By the 80s, you describe a Soviet Union in which the original legitimating ideology is essentially dead and needs to be replaced by something else, and that is a part of Gorbachev's project. To what extent does American pressure on human rights, to what extent does Scoop Jackson and the early neocons, like what role do they play in this diminishment of Soviet self-confidence, and to what extent is it purely internal and the American role in it is not that significant?
I mean, this is a hugely complicated question, of course, because there are different aspects to this. If you look at the late 70s and, even going back to Scoop Jackson and his insistence on changing Russian Soviet immigration laws, did that have any impact? I think it mainly just irritated the Soviets. When Carter insisted, for example, on the fact that the Soviets were not, we're not paying enough attention to human rights, that annoyed the Soviets for a particular reason. They felt that this was an example of American lecturing, and they hated being lectured to. They thought that this was not in line with their self-perception as a great power. Because if you're a great power, why is it America lectures to you? So this is something that I think, in a sense, helped undermine Détente. It did not really necessarily have any positive outcomes. There was a very interesting discussion between Carter and Brzezinski at one point, where Brzezinski tells Carter, well, they're so sensitive about this human rights issue because they understand that, and I'm paraphrasing Brzezinski, of course, but he basically says something like, they understand how important it is. They understand their weakness here, et cetera, et cetera. But in reality, what the Soviets worried about is not, they did not fear American criticism of human rights for the sake of human rights. What they worried about was the idea of being seen as an inferior power, being lectured to. And that's very important. Then as we move into the 1980s, we have not just this aspect, not just the human rights aspect, but we have another aspect, and that is we have Reagan with his ideas about nuclear arms race. And I ask in the book, I said, to what extent did this play into Gorbachev's reforms? And the answer is also quite complicated. In the end, it did actually matter. It did matter because Gorbachev talked about this. Gorbachev said at Politburo meetings, we're being outspent by the Americans. We cannot keep up. So what should we do? This was one of the factors for example, Gorbachev's pursuit of nuclear arms control. But there were other factors as well. So we cannot ignore the fact that Gorbachev genuinely was afraid of nuclear conflict. Remember, of course, this came shortly after 1983, Able Archer. The world was seemingly on the brink of a war, and Gorbachev was very much in power at that time. I mean, not in power as the general secretary, but basically involved in Politburo meetings. He was certainly understanding what was going on. He was also equally afraid of a nuclear war. And of course, when Chernobyl happened in 1986, this added to Gorbachev's apprehension. And I have a remarkable citation in the book, which is unprintable, unfortunately. I think they printed it in the book, but it's probably unspeakable when Gorbachev spoke about what nuclear war would mean for Europe. So that was another factor. But I think fundamentally, and this is where your reference becomes so important when you said that the Soviets were basically realizing that ideology, revolutionary ideology was no good. Gorbachev clearly realized that, and he looked to replace that with something else. He still wanted, like Soviet leaders before him, he still wanted recognition of Soviet leadership. And that is important. And you can see a lot of the Soviet foreign policy initiatives in light of this quest for recognition, quest for leadership, quest for legitimacy through recognition as a global power. And he put a lot of emphasis on this idea of new thinking, and in the Cold War, great power responsibility for peace in the world. And I argue in the book that, interestingly, ironically enough, many of these ideas actually go straight back to Brezhnev, straight back to Khrushchev. So new thinking was not so new after all. But in any case, what Gorbachev was trying to do was to simply, assert Soviet leadership, but reinvent Soviet greatness on a new basis.
The final question, but it's a double-barreled big question, so we might go on for a while with it. Why did Gorbachev's project fail in the end? And then part two is, considering I think most Americans would like to see the Chinese Communist Party's control of China collapse in the way that communism collapsed in Russia, or the Communist Party's control of Russia collapsed. What lessons can we draw from the end of the Soviet Union for American attitudes towards China today?
So this is a super interesting question, very difficult question. I think if we're looking for sources of Soviet collapse, and the larger than life factor is, of course, economics. Khrushchev had promised to build communism within 20 years, but it didn't work. And it was already clear to the Soviets already by the mid-1960s that it wasn't going to work. In fact, if we look at the Politburo discussions, they all knew what was going to happen. In 1968, Andropov wrote a memo to Brezhnev arguing that the Soviet Union was falling behind in R&D and education and all, in labor efficiency, all kinds of factors, predicting effectively the Soviet defeat in the Cold War. What happened to this memo? It was found on Brezhnev's desk when he died in November 1982. So Brezhnev knew, but he just didn't know what to do about it. He did not know. Andropov did not know what to do about it. So in the end, it's important that economic prosperity, economic growth, this is the true source of legitimacy for any government. If the government cannot deliver on the quality of life, then they will have problems. And the Soviets were trying to supplant the lack of domestic legitimacy, for they had no political legitimacy domestically, nor indeed economic, in terms of economic prosperity. They did not have that. They were trying to supplant that lack of domestic legitimacy with external legitimacy, externally endowed, legitimacy given to them through recognition by other great powers. But in the end, this contradiction between the Soviet self-perception as a great power and the reality that it really wasn't. It really wasn't. That is what drove the whole Soviet project into the ground. So the fact that the Soviets couldn't deliver economically, I think, is what ultimately brought them to ruin. Now, if we turn to China, I think the Chinese recognized this problem earlier than the Soviets. And when did they recognize this? Well, clearly in the 1970s already, when they looked at the mess of the Great Leap Forward, they looked at the mess of cultural revolution that rocked China beginning from 1957 and all the way to effectively until Mao's death in 1976. And I think they realized that really greatness matters, and they also cared about greatness. They all cared, Mao Zedong included, Deng Xiaoping included. They really cared about greatness and bringing China back to centrality in international order. But the means of achieving this greatness could not be the same as what Mao Zedong was trying to do. Because Mao Zedong was too ideological in his approach to some of these things and could not understand what worked. And of course, Deng Xiaoping was much more pragmatic when it came to these things and decided to really pursue the road of development, abandon the road of revolution. That happened in the 1970s, and provide the economic foundation for Chinese domestic legitimacy, upon which external legitimacy can also rest. So the Chinese have a much better sense in this regard, and that's why today the Soviet Union is no more, but China is America's strategic competitor. So where do we find ourselves? Well, it's this Cold War is still to resolve itself, and I think the verdict is out.
Well, to prepare for its conduct, I can't imagine a better recommendation than to recommend everyone should read Sergey Radchenko's To Run the World, the Kremlin's Cold War Bid for Global Power. It's a really impressive contribution. This has been a really interesting conversation. Thanks so much for making the time.
Oh, thank you for having me on the podcast.
This is a Nebulous Media production. Find us wherever you get your podcasts.